morning to all of you. Today we are going on with our last module number 4. Today we are doing movement poetry. M-O-V-E-M-E-N-T, movement poetry. In the 1950s, a group of poets, a collection of poets, reacted against the poetry of 1940s. The previous decades poetry was reacted upon by a group of poets during the 1950s. What happened in 1950 in the realm of poetry? In the 1950s, a group of poets reacted against the poetry of the 1940s and their poetry. Those who reacted against the poetry of 1940s and their poetry came to be known as, their poetry or their poems came to be known as, they came to be called movement poetry. So what is movement poetry? What is the answer in a sentence? In the 1950s, a group of poets reacted against the poetry of 1940s and their poetry came to be called movement poetry. D.J. Enright's anthology, D.J. Enright's collection of poems. How is it titled? Poets of the 50s. Poets of the 50s, it was published in the year 1950 itself. D.J. Enright's anthology or collection of poems entitled Poets of the 50s, which was published, which got into being in the year 1950. And Robert Conquest, another poet during the 50s, Robert Conquest anthology, his anthology. His poetry was entitled Anthology. It was published in the year 1956. Anthology was published in the year 1956. These two collections of poems by D.J. Enright and Robert Conquest brought 9 new poets into notice. This anthology of poems brought 9 new poets to notice or to limelight. Who were the 9 poets? They were John Wayne, W-A-I-N-A, John Wayne. Kingsley Amis, K-N-G-S-L-E-Y-A-M-I-S, Kingsley Amis. John Hathaway, Donald Davy, and D.J. Enright. D.J. Enright, the poet of poets of the 50s. D.J. Enright. Philip Larkin. Thomas Guno. Robert Conquest, the writer of the collection of poems anthology, which was out in the year 1956. Robert Conquest and Elizabeth Jennings. These were the 9 poets who were brought out by the collection of poems published in the year 1950 and 1956. They were John Wayne, Kingsley Amis, John Hathaway, Donald Davy, D.J. Enright, Philip Larkin, Thomas Guno, Robert Conquest, and Elizabeth Jennings. The majority of these 9 poets belonged to working class or lower middle class. The majority of these poets belonged either to working class or lower middle class, and all of them were educated. Another speciality was All of these poets were educated in Oxford or Cambridge University. They were educated either from Oxford University or Cambridge University. They were educated poets. So you should remember this point. The majority of the 9 poets introduced by D.J. Enright and Robert Conquest belonged to the working class or the lower middle class, and all of them were educated either in Oxford University or Cambridge University. They were classified as, they have got another name also, they were classified as university wits or New Emersonians. University wits or New Emersonians. This was another nickname attributed to them. How were they known? These poets were known as, or these poets were classified as university wits or New Emersonians. But later, critics called these new poets. Critics began to call these new poets as belonging to the movement. They began to call these poets as belonging to the movement. Thus they came to be known as movement poets. So these university wits or the New Emersonians were later labeled by critics as belonging to the movement, and thus they were known as movement poets. These poets sought rather to create new things, create novel methods, rather than to pour themselves out in lamentations. They did not believe in pouring out lamentations or sorrow throughout the poems. They wanted to construct their own methods. They wanted to construct new poetic devices. They also wanted to create new ideas. They never wanted to pour out or depict the innermost sorrows through poems. So this was their speciality. Or another noteworthy feature of these poets was this. What was it? It was these poets sought rather to create newer things, than to pour out lamentations. They did not want to pour out lamentations or sorrow or sadness throughout their poems. Then first Elizabeth Jennings. She was born in the year 1926. 1926 was the year in which Elizabeth Jennings, the movement poetess, was born. Elizabeth Jennings, she was born in the year 1926. In her poems, her anthology of poems was entitled Poems itself, Poems, which was published in 1953. Elizabeth Jennings published her anthology of poems in 1953. And also another collection of poems, A Way of Looking, which was written and published in the year 1955. So her first anthology of poems entitled Poems, it was published in 1953, and Way of Looking was published in 1955. And these collections of poems exhibited departure from the poetry of the bygone years. These collection of poems had a distinct departure, distinct going away from the bygone poetry or poetry of the bygone years. Bygone years means past years. Let the bygones be bygones, thus goes a saying in English. Remember that also. Yes. So Elizabeth Jennings' poetry deviated from the poetry of the bygone or the past years or the poetry of the 1940s. Her later poetry entitled, the collection was entitled A Sense of the World. A sense, not essence, A Sense of the World, which was published in the year 1958. 1958. The collection of poems was got published. What is the title of the collection? A Sense of the World. A Sense of the World. And Song for a Birth and a Death. Another collection of poems is Song for a Birth and a Death. Song for a Birth and a Death, which was published in the year 1962, 59 years back. 1962 expresses these two collections of poems express impressions of these two collections of poems express or show or depict invasion of things physical things. I lost the number once again. These two collections of poems depict or show or exhibit invasions of things physical. Invasion. These poems expresses in an invasive way of physical things or physical things. And these poems have a deep impact on emotions. These collections of poems exert deep impact on emotions of human minds. Emotions. They do not show any kind of impact. They do not show any kind of influence on physical things, material things, physical things. These poems show or express deep impact on emotions of human minds. Okay, understood? Elizabeth Jennings' poetry is correct, tight, and expresses a restrained emotion. Her poetry is formal and expresses emotions in a restrained manner. Her poems express emotions in a restrained manner. The poems of Elizabeth Jennings express emotions in a controlled manner. That is what is restrained manner, controlled manner. Movement poetry was a reaction against the pedantic highbrow poetry of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, with its profusion of textual references and allusions. What are the typical features of movement poetry? Number one, movement poetry was a reaction against the pedantic. Pedantic means excessively concerned with minor details or rules. Deeply concerned with the minor details and grammatic rules and all the rules of poetry. That is what is pedantic. Pedantic poetry. Pedantic. Firstly, movement poetry was a reaction against the pedantic highbrow poetry. Poetry meant for educated class. Highbrow poetry. Poetry meant for the aristocratic class, educated class of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. It is full of allusions and intertextual references which are very difficult for the common man to understand. So, movement poetry was a reaction against the pedantic highbrow poetry of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. With its profusion, their poetry was in profusion. Profusion means richness. Their poetry had richness. Their poetry had abundance of intertextual references. References from various texts. References from various different texts and allusions. And also their poetry is elusive. Their poems are elusive. Whose poems? The poems of T.S.A.Litt and Ezra Pound. And movement poets reacted against these things. So movement poetry was a reaction against the pedantic and highbrow poetry of T.S.A.Litt and Ezra Pound with its profusion of intertextual references and allusions. The movement poets regarded the excess of theme and stylistic devices as bad principles. The movement poets regarded the excess of theme, the abundance of theme, and stylistic devices, the stylistic methods, as bad principles to be followed in poetry. What was their staunch belief? They had a staunch belief that the excess of theme and stylistic devices, stylistic methods are bad principles. They had a negative determination to avoid these bad principles. They had a negative determination. So this determination was not at all positive, because this determination of disregarding excess of theme and stylistic devices, it is bad for the growth of poetry. It is bad, of course, bad for the development of poetry. In that sense, it is a negative determination. And poets had a negative determination to avoid these bad principles. Which are the bad principles according to them? The excess of theme and stylistic devices. They are the bad principles according to the movement poets. And they took a negative determination, a destructive determination to avoid these bad principles. They endeavored to make poetry appealing and intelligible. They tried their maximum to make poetry appealing. Appealing means attractive. And intelligible means understandable to all. Understandable to one and all. See, what did they try? They tried to make poetry. They endeavored to make poetry. They took efforts to make poetry appealing and intelligible. Intelligible, understandable to everyone. They used the language of everyday life. In their poetry or in their poems, these movement poets used the language of everyday life, the language of common people, the language of ordinary people. Thus, their poetry became understandable to one and all. All of the people could easily understand what they wrote. The movement poetry was urbane. Urbane means refined, cultured. How was the movement poetry? The movement poetry was urbane. U-R-B-A-N-E. Urbane and anti-romantic. They are never romantic or poetic. They are anti-romantic. Their poems were anti-romantic in nature. Their poems were anti-romantic and urbane, refined. Their poetry presented the problems of the educated middle class. Their poems presented the problems of the educated middle class and those of contemporary society, and those problems existing in the contemporary society. Their poetry presented the problems of the educated middle class and those problems of contemporary society. But it had no solutions to offer. Even though the poetry presented all these problems, they never offered any solution to solve these crucial problems faced by the society. It had no solutions to offer. The movement poets used traditional verse forms. Another feature of movement poetry was this: the movement poets used traditional, earlier verse forms. They used traditional verse forms, that is usually with iambic pentameter. Most of the poems were written in iambic pentameter. And stanza form, they had stanza form. They never wrote in free verse. They had stanza form and rhyme. They also observed a rhyme pattern. In their poems, they kept the rhyme pattern also. So this was the traditional style of poetry. They followed the traditional style of poetry, such as verse forms, usually with iambic pentameter and stanza form, and rhyme. All the same, even though these poems had these merits, all the same there were certain glaring drawbacks, shortcomings in movement poetry. Even though their poetry had all these merits, this poetry also had some demerits or drawbacks. Whatever the demerits or drawbacks the movement poems had. So all the same, there were certain crucial, glaring, burning drawbacks in movement poetry. As the movement poet Kingsley Amis has aptly pointed out, Kingsley Amis had very aptly, very accurately, very appropriately pointed out, their deficiency is the meagreness. MEAGRENESS, meagreness. Meagreness means lack of quality or quantity. Meagreness, lack of quality and quantity. Meagreness and triviality. Triviality means silliness. Triviality of the subject matter. One of the glaring drawbacks of the movement poetry was the meagreness and triviality of the subject matter or theme. Subject matter means theme. The meagreness and triviality of the subject matter, and no movement poets wanted grand theme. Do one of the movement poets. We are turning our attention to a great movement poet who is none other than Philip Larkin. PHILIPLARKIN. Philip Larkin. Philip Larkin is the most important of the movement poets. He is the most important of the movement poets. So, Philip Larkin. He sought to make English poetry intelligent and comprehensible, means understandable. He tried to make English poetry intelligent and comprehensible, means understandable to one and all. That was his aim. What was his aim? His aim was to make English poetry intelligent and comprehensible. For a short spell, for a short period, for a short time, Larkin was influenced by W.B. Yeats. For a short period in his poetic career, Larkin was influenced by W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. We have done about W.B. Yeats. For a brief period, brief time, Larkin was greatly influenced by the William Butler Yeats. It is evident from this influence is very clear. His influence of W.B. Yeats is very clear in his first collection of poems. Philip Larkin's first collection of poems testifies that he was greatly influenced by W.B. Yeats. Which was his first collection of poems? The North Ship. The North Ship, which was published in 1945. The year of the publication of the collection of poems, The North Ship, was in 1945. And from this collection it is clear, it is easily understandable that he was greatly influenced by W. Yeats for a short period in his poetic career. Very soon, very immediately, he outgrew the Yeatsian influence. He was able to come out of Yeatsian influence and came under the spell of Thomas Hardy. He came under the magic spell of Thomas Hardy, the novelist as well as poet. Very soon he was able to outgrow the Yeatsian influence. He was able to come out of the influence of W.B. Yeats, and he came under the magic spell of Thomas Hardy, the novelist and poet. Thomas Hardy. The injured romantic temperament, the broken romantic attitude, the emotionally hurt romantic attitude lurked hid beneath his mask of irony. He was a master of irony, and under the mask of irony, there lurked or there remained hidden what? The injured romantic temperament, the injured romantic attitude of the poet. So we can say the injured romantic temperament that lurked, that hid beneath the mask of irony labeled Larkin as. It gave a title to Larkin as. It made him known as an anti-romantic poet. Larkin was labeled as anti-romantic. An anti-romantic. What labeled him as an anti-romantic poet? The injured romantic temperament that hid or that lurked beneath his mask of irony made him called as an anti-romantic poet, or labeled him as anti-romantic. He was a literary nihilist. Nihilist, N-I-H-I-L-I-S-T. Nihilist means a person who believes that life is meaningless and rejects all religious and moral principles. Such a person is called a nihilist. Who is a nihilist? A person who believes that life is meaningless and rejects all religious and moral principles is called a nihilist. He was a literary nihilist. Philip Larkin was a literary nihilist because he was incapable of seeing anything enjoyable in human life. He didn't find anything enjoyable, anything happier in human life. He only saw the sad side of human life. He was incapable of seeing anything enjoyable in human life. His poems are meant for ordinary world people. His poems are not meant for eyebrow people. It was meant for ordinary world of people. That means ordinary people, common people. His poems were meant for to be understood by common people. Meant to be understood by common people, ordinary people. His poems are meant for the common ordinary people or ordinary world of people. Hence, Larkin is known as, it gave him another title. It fetched him another title. What was it? His poems, which were meant for the poor ordinary people, fetched him another title known as the laureate of the common man. He was the laureate, poet of the common man, laureate of the common man, laureate of the common man, poet of the common man. So it earned him his love for common people or ordinary people earned him the title Laureate of the Common Man, means Poet of the Common Man. Poet of the Common Man, Laureate of the Common Man. Larkin's poetry is noted for originality of the subject matter. What are the features of Larkin's poetry? Larkin's poetry is noted, it is notable for the originality, reality of the subject matter, or he was very original in his subject matter. So his poems are noted for the originality or subject matter. His poems are highly notable for the originality of the subject matter. A regular stanzaic form. His poems contained the regular stanzaic form following the traditional method. Regular stanzaic forms, careful diction, careful choice of words. He very carefully chose words. He very carefully selected words. His choice of words was highly careful. He very carefully chose words for his poems. Careful diction and artful syntax. Artful means very clever structure. He followed a very careful structure in his poems. Artful syntax. His poems expose xenophobia. And another feature of his poems is that all of them, or most of them, expose or depict xenophobia. Xenophobia means dislike of or prejudice against people from foreign countries. Dislike of or prejudice against people from other countries, that is foreign countries, other countries, that is xenophobia. His poems express xenophobia, that means dislike of people from other countries or prejudice against people from other countries. And his attitude towards modernism and also his attitude to sex. He had a special attitude for sex. He was very fond of depicting sex in his poems. So these are the features of his poems. His poems expose xenophobia and modernism and his attitude to sex. His attitude to sex is very vividly clear. So now let us see his literary output. How much is his literary contribution? The North Ship, we have mentioned this name earlier. The first collection of his poems, North Ship, which was published in the year 1945. Then The Less Deceived, which was published in 1955. Then another collection, New Lines, published in 1956. New Lines got published in 1956. The Wilson Weddings, a poem included in the MA syllabus. It was published in 1964. The Wilson Weddings, 1964. High Windows, the collection of poems, The High Windows, published in 1974. And Collected Poems, an anthology of poems, a collection of poems, collected poems, published in 1988. So these are the collections of Larkin's poetry. So this is the literary output of Larkin. These are the literary contribution of Philip Larkin. Larkin also has to his credit. That means he has also to his credit two novels. He has also written two novels. One is Jill, published in 1946. Jill. And A Gale in Winter. These are the two novels. They are not as popular as his poems. Anyhow, he wrote two novels, Jill and A Gale in Winter. So this much is needed about Philip Larkin for our BA class. Okay, study these things very carefully and write the forthcoming examinations quite well.